From McCain Auditorium on the campus of Kansas State University in Manhattan, the K-State Radio Network presents now an address by the Secretary of Agriculture, Bob Bergland, speaking in the Landon Lecture series on public issues here at K-State. Secretary Bergland's address this morning, appropriately enough, entitled Toward a National Food Policy. Today's lecture is a festive occasion. It marks the 90th birthday of former Kansas Governor Alf M. Landon, for whom the lecture series is named. The dignitaries have arrived on the stage now in what appears to us to be a full house in McCain Auditorium, so we'll switch to the stage and Kansas State University President Dr. Dwayne Walker.
We welcome you to the 38th Landon Lecture here at Kansas State University. My name is Dwayne Walker. We have an excellent program for you today. First, I would like to introduce several members of the platform party who will not themselves be making comments. On your right, Dr. Frank Orizem, who is president of the Faculty Senate and a professor of economics at Kansas State. On your left, Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh, who is a professor of economics and chairman of the Landon Lecture series. And now I would like to read to you a resolution that was passed this morning by the United States Senate, introduced by Senator Robert Dole and co-sponsored by Senator James Pearson. Passed at 9:15 this morning, Eastern Standard Time. Resolved that the Senate hereby extends to the Honorable Alf Landon its greetings and well wishes on the occasion of his 90th birthday on September 9, 1977. The Senate expresses its admiration and gratitude to Governor Landon for his many years of distinguished service to the people of Kansas and the United States. The Senate expresses its appreciation to Governor Landon for his contributions as governor of Kansas, presidential candidate, statesman, progressive and venerable leader of the political party, civic leader, humanitarian, and successful businessman, and for his interest in young people, passed this morning by the United States Senate. Governor, the start of a tremendous birthday party for a tremendous person. I would like to now introduce Mr. Terry Matlack, who is the student body president at Kansas State University. Terry?
Thank you, President Ocker. Governor Landon, it's a special privilege to be a part of campus today when we get to celebrate your 90th birthday. It's an event that I think students have been looking forward to for quite some time. Now, as you may or may not know, Thursday evenings our Student Senate meets, and last night they unanimously passed a resolution that they wanted me to share with you today. So I'll read it to you now. Whereas the Honorable Alf Landon has broadened the horizons of Kansas State students throughout the years and has contributed to the pursuit of knowledge, and whereas this student body wishes to show their appreciation and give him due recognition. And whereas Alf Landon is a 1908 graduate of the other university in Kansas, reputedly on the Kaw River, and as such has been denied the pleasure, privileges, benefits, and satisfactions of being an actual member of the Kansas State University student body. Be it enacted that Alf Landon be approved as a bona fide member of the Kansas State University student body. Section 2, he shall also be presented with a validated student ID. So, Governor Landon, if you would come forward, it would do me great pleasure to present you with your validated student ID. And in case you have any trouble proving your studenthood, you can refer to the picture on the back for positive identification. We also wanted to present Governor Landon with a birthday present. And originally, we thought we'd present him with a plaque or something that would be appropriate. But then we thought we wanted something that would be a little more special, a little more specific to this occasion. And so, I'll take the bow off. We would like to present you with this piece of work done by Chester Peters, Vice President for Student Affairs. And for those of you who can't see, it's a sunflower. In the middle of the sunflower, you can barely distinguish a 9 and an O, standing for his 90th birthday. And we think this to be very special, because as a sunflower represents Kansas, Alf Landon has represented Kansans, their personality, and our people. And we would like to thank him for the wonderful character that he has exhibited for the state of Kansas. So from the students of Kansas State University, I present you with this birthday present.
I just take a minute to express from the radio to the radio audience as well as the student and body here my deep appreciation. Now you can just give me one more honor. See a good football team up here.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the Secretary of Agriculture. Bob Bergland brings to that office important experience. He is a farmer. He operates a 600-acre Minnesota farm that produces small grains and lawn seed. Mr. Bergland is the first farmer to serve as Secretary of Agriculture since the 1940s. Second, Mr. Bergland is well acquainted with national and international agriculture. This morning we visited about some of our mutual acquaintances in the Philippines, and as you know, Kansas State will be involved soon in that country. And he has served as congressional advisor to the 17th session of the Food and Agriculture Organization Conference in Rome in 1973, and was a delegate from the House of Representatives to the UN Conference on Trade and Development in Kenya in 1976. Back in 1961, Mr. Bergland was named chairman of the Minnesota Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. 2 years later, he moved to Washington to serve as Midwest director for that agency. And it was during his time as the area director, the Midwest director, that I became acquainted with Bob Bergland at a Great Plains Agricultural Council meeting. I believe it was along about 1966 or 67. I went home and told my wife that I'd met a young farmer who was an area director for that agency, who I was sure from the subtleties in his conversation was thinking about running for Congress. And I personally hoped that he would, and he would be a tremendous leader. In 1970, Mr. Bergland was elected to represent Minnesota's 7th Congressional District. In the House, Mr. Bergland served as chairman of the House Agriculture Subcommittee on Conservation and Credit, and was a member of the Subcommittee on Livestock and Grains and Dairy and Poultry. When he was named Secretary of Agriculture, he was at that time ranking Democratic member on 2 subcommittees of the House Small Business Committee. Bob Bergland also served on the executive committees of the Congressional Rural Caucus and Democratic Study Groups. When Bob Bergland accepted President Carter's offer to become Secretary of Agriculture, he did so against the advice of his father. Selmer Bergland had said that he thought his son was a fool to accept the job. But Secretary Bergland chose to accept advice given by his father much earlier. After losing his farm during the Great Depression, Selmer Bergland told his children, "Politics is power. Get in it." So Bob Bergland brings to his office an agrarian background, an understanding of agricultural issues, a working knowledge of the American political system, and a commitment to action. Today, he will deliver the 38th Alfred M. Landon Lecture on Public Issues, his message toward a national food policy. It is an honor to present to you the Secretary of Agriculture, Bob Bergland.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Acre, for the very kind introduction. I have heard a great deal about Governor Alf Landon from, among others, my father, who was 87 years of age on the 3rd day of July, and who, like you, Governor Landon, has always had the courage to speak his mind. And when Jimmy Carter made me this proposition, my dad used words which I cannot repeat in polite company to remind me that secretaries of agriculture have never been known for their popularity, and that anyone who would leave elective office to take an appointed job ought to have his or her head examined, or words to that effect. My father is an admirer of yours, Governor Landon, a contemporary who watched you from a great distance, but admired you, as do the people of the United States. You indeed are a legend in your own time. I talked with the President on yesterday, who knew I was coming here to this event, and he sent a message for me to you, Governor Landon. If I may, I would like to read and present you with this note to Governor Alf Landon, dated September 6, 1977, from the White House. I would like very much to be in Kansas. Personally wish you a most happy and healthy 90th birthday. 40 years ago, as governor of Kansas, you managed to reduce taxes and balance the budget, which makes you very much a man after my own heart. Here in Washington, we are still trying. As one of our country's most distinguished elder statesmen, with many years of public service to your credit, you exemplify dedication to the progressive ideals of American democracy. Sincerely, Jimmy Carter. I'm honored to be here on this day, to be a part of these proceedings, recognizing the greatness of one of our own, Governor Landon. And it's appropriate that these proceedings be hosted here at Kansas State. And I'm particularly pleased to be in Kansas, which is literally the breadbasket of the world, to talk about the evolution of a national food policy. I was in the Philippines recently and was advised by leaders of that government of the kinds of arrangements which have been concluded with this university in distributing the knowledge which has come here to those persons of the world who are less fortunate than we. And Kansas itself is depended on by literally tens of millions of people throughout this world
I was born in 1928, and during my lifetime, the major farm problem has been living with too much. During my lifetime, we've invented hybrid seeds and fertilizers and pesticides and modern farming technology, all of which has been applied, the results of which have been a blessing, but in some quarters regarded as a burden because of the attendant economic stress which surpluses bring to American agriculture. During the last half dozen years, our horizons have expanded beyond the shores of the United States to a point where most of our wheat is consumed by persons who live beyond the borders of this great land. I was in Japan, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the Philippine Islands. I've been in Africa. I've been in Italy. I've been in other places of the world, and the same question is asked time and again: can we depend upon you in the United States? I've heard them that we have the finest system of agriculture that has ever been designed, the finest and the most progressive and innovating people that could ever be trained, with the most advanced technology that the mind of man could invent, along with the world's best land and a system will enable the world to depend upon us. And it's to that subject I would like to dedicate these more formal remarks toward a national food policy. The story of food is a story of extremes. The scenario goes like this: drought and disaster, food shortages, high farm prices and high food prices, widespread hunger and malnutrition throughout the world, or good weather, surpluses, food glut, dwindling exports, low farm prices, but still high food costs, and continuing worldwide hunger. The whole story of food defies all logic. But then weather has always defied logic, and weather is the decisive factor in food production. No amount of legislation, no amount of economic fine-tuning, no administrative decisions can cope with the vagaries of weather. Not yet, at least. But what about the other factors in our food picture? As Winston Churchill once said, quote, "Any problem made by man can be solved by man," end of quote. Boom and bust price cycles, commodity markets, economic policies, food distribution programs, foreign and domestic, all of these are man-made creations, and while we cannot fool with Mother Nature or even second-guess her, logic tells us that in our collective wisdom, we should be able to establish a semblance of stability and predictability in the whole food production, distribution, and consumption process. It is not only essential that we do so, it is today's urgent challenge. What is needed, of course, is a national food policy. The time is long past when we can afford to tinker with this massive and complicated problem on a piecemeal basis. The food problem is much more than a farm problem. It is much more than a local or even a national problem. It is international in scope. The national food policy is not a new concept. It dates back at least 3,000 years, going to the days of Joseph, the original Secretary of Agriculture, when he persuaded the people of Egypt to store their grain in the 7 fat years of harvest so they could eat in the 7 lean years, as recorded in the 41st chapter of Genesis. A primitive concept? Yes, but a very basic one. The difficulty in grasping the whole implications of a national and international food policy today, to say nothing of establishing one, stems from the magnitude of the problem. It literally boggles the mind. So let us briefly examine the problem by breaking it down to its major components: production, the land, and the farmer. That's where the whole food system chain starts. This and the ultimate consumption of food are the two most important links in the food chain. A sound national food policy must start with the farmer. If not, the whole concept breaks down. To maintain a high level of food production to meet our domestic needs and our foreign obligations requires that farmers be reasonably assured of the economic capability to do so. It's as simple as that. To achieve this objective is not so simple, as we all know. The failures and inadequacies of past farm programs are responsible for a general resistance and skepticism of the necessity and the efficacy of such programs by consumers, by labor, by business, and even some farmers themselves. Part of this skepticism is justified because of the failure to mesh farm programs into a total national food policy. We treated low farm prices and high farm prices and shortages and surpluses and all the rest as a single isolated problem. Now we know differently. The perennial plaguing problems that beset our agricultural plant when we casually dismissed both politically and economically as a so-called farm problem, but really it is a problem of national concern with international consequences. Over the past 40 years of farm programs, we have tried just about everything. Rigid price supports tied to the parity concept, the ever-normal grain rate, the acreage allotments, the soil banks, government storage programs where the Commodity Credit Corporation becomes the real market for farm produce, domestic food programs geared solely to alleviating surpluses, not to better national nutrition, and international food aid programs that amounted to nothing much more than international charity programs, and practically no farm export or foreign market development program worthy of the name. All were well-intentioned, but all were found inadequate. In more recent years, we even returned to the old laissez-faire, free market farm policies. It was an exciting primrose path while it lasted. But it was a path that led to broken dreams because it was based on the unrealistic hope that American farmers would be forever blessed with good weather, while the rest of the world were victims of drought or other natural disasters. $3 corn, $6 wheat, and $12 soybeans unleashed an unlimited fence-to-fence farm production and unprecedented farm exports, lulled farmers in the nation into the false belief that this was the state of normalcy. Free, unfettered enterprise is still a sacrosanct concept in our economic culture. But when applied to the total food chain problem, it is, at best, a nice-sounding bit of rhetoric, a simple placebo answer to a highly complex problem. As far as food production is concerned within the total framework of national food policy, we must find a middle ground where basic market forces can still work with a minimum of federal interference. Neither farmers nor consumers, neither this nation nor the world, can afford to rely solely on the caprice of weather and a freewheeling commodity market as the only determinants of a national food policy. Logic would lead one to expect that there would be a close and direct relationship between farm prices and food prices. The correlation is scant and sometimes non-existent. To illustrate, in 1952, the price of hard milling wheat on the Minneapolis and the Kansas City markets was around $3 a bushel. Bread sold for about 20 cents a loaf. The farmer's share of that loaf of bread was between 7 and 8 cents. Today, 25 years later, wheat on the same market sells for $2 and less. Bread is 45 to 55 cents a loaf, and the farmer's share is a little over 3 cents. Bread today is selling at even higher prices with wheat $2 than when wheat was $5 a bushel in 1974. This is the nub of the farmer-consumer price spread problem. For farmers, what comes up in the way of prices must always and ultimately come down. For the consumer, it is a different story. What goes up remains up or goes even higher. Who is the villain in this illogical price discrepancy? The answer is everyone and no one. Traditionally, where the finger of blame was pointed depended on who was doing the pointing. Consumers as a group used to blame farmers and farm programs. They also accused food handlers and processors and food retailers for excessive rip-offs. Farmers blamed consumers for not understanding their problems and their failure to support needed programs. Farmers accused organized labor and business for high cost of production, and so it went on and on. Everyone viewed the farm problem from their own narrow frame of reference. Barring a national economic policy of stringent price, wage, profit controls, which no one wants, the alternative is to provide a national policy to bring stability to those forces that are controllable. We can and we should provide farmers with reasonable price assurance, not guaranteed profits, to keep our agricultural plant a viable economic industry that is capable of sustained high production year in and year out. Such a price-supporting program should be geared to out-of-pocket production cost plus reasonable return on land investment. The new farm program would set that return at between 3 and 4%. Any higher rate would invite a new round of highly inflated farmland costs, out of reach to the young farmer, the average farmer, and available to the speculator and the very large established operator. We can and we should provide the mechanism to establish a farmer-owned food reserve of storable commodities through a loan program and other devices. This will accomplish 3 necessary objectives: help level out the disastrous boom and bust price cycles for farmers, maintain adequate reserves of food for consumers in bad crop years as well as good, and help stabilize food prices. And thirdly, keep us competitive as dependable suppliers in the all-important and vital export markets. We can and we should meet all our commitments to raise the food standards at home through our reformed food stamp and other food distribution programs, and fulfill our obligations to the expanded Food for Peace and foreign market development programs. Food today is one of our most effective instruments to achieve world understanding and eventual enduring peace. This is an exciting prospect and an exciting responsibility. Before 1972, the importance of agricultural exports to the United States farmer was often disregarded. Today, it is axiomatic that farm product exports are essential to farm prosperity and to the national economy. We have learned this lesson well, and at times the learning was painful. But we have survived those ups and downs and are today doing quite well in the export trade, in fact, better than ever. In fiscal year 1976, we exported the production of almost 1 out of 3 harvested acres, or about 100 million acres of produce from this land. For some farmers, the ratio is even higher. Today, nearly 1 out of 4 dollars earned by the American farmer comes from overseas sales. Unfortunately, some success sometimes breeds over-expectation and overreaction. And it could be argued that international trade and food aid have become too conspicuous as a part of the agricultural scene. Low prices in one commodity or other are attributed to increased imports or a decline in exports. The federal government is somehow involved in international trade. Hence, some say the federal government is responsible for the problem. Unfortunately, this has been true. But international trade is far more complex than that. A good rain at the right time or bad weather in any major producing area of the world may have more effect on world supplies and prices than all the government policies in this world laid end to end. We are currently concerned over low wheat prices, and current wheat prices are undeniably linked to world markets. We, however, keep reminding ourselves that on the whole we are doing extremely well in world trade. There are only one or two exceptions. These are important, of course, and must be dealt with. But the fact is that on the whole, we are looking at another record export year. Last fiscal year, U.S. farm exports were valued at $23 billion. With farm imports valued at $10.5 billion, the agricultural trade contributed to a net surplus of more than $12 billion to our balance of trade. With the costs of imported oil mounting, the contribution of U.S. farm exports to the national balance of trade is increasingly important. In order to protect farmer income without sacrificing markets, we are supporting a target price concept to assure stable incomes in a time of increasing supplies, as we now have in wheat. At the same time, we are negotiating with other governments to assure, among other things, that in both times of excess supply and crop shortfall, other nations will share in the cost and the obligation to stabilize world trade and ensure the world's importing nations enough to meet their needs. As we move on these various fronts, we should avoid being led into bad policies which will compound the problem, such as excessively high price supports and export subsidies. Annually, we are doing very well in the export business, and we must continue and build on this success. We recognize the current exceptions to this success. We recognize the importance of these exceptions. We are acting to correct the instabilities that have contributed so much to the current problems of grain producers. A national food policy of this scope is not only economically sound and right, it is ethically and morally right as well. And that is an ultimate achievement of any national policy when both are served. It would be immoral to permit our farm family system of agriculture to be weakened and fall into disarray. It would be economically disastrous to the whole nation. It would be morally wrong to disregard the nutritional needs of millions of poverty-level American families or to ignore the hunger of 500 million people throughout the world who live at the razor's edge of existence. It is in our own economic best interest to join the rest of the world, to join the rest of the food surplus nations in this worldwide effort, because peace and stability are at stake. Our food, in my judgment, will be a major component, if not the centerpiece, in President Carter's commitment to human rights worldwide. By filling this commitment, we have everything to gain and nothing to lose. The farm program, which we will soon have, laboriously and painstakingly put together by the Congress and this administration with the support of farm and consumer groups, is a good program. It's a sound program, and it marks the first major step this nation has taken toward a national food policy. No one contends that it is the final end-all, do-all answer to ours or the world's food problems, but it is a program that provides a good base to maintain a strong American agriculture, a healthy, well-fed nation, and one that will help us fulfill our responsibilities to the rest of this world. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your indulgence, and my understanding is that from now until 11:30 or so, that I will be hosting a question-answer session. The responsibilities have been evenly divided for this part of this program. I will answer those questions in which the answer is easy and obvious. Governor Landon will take all the rest.
A comment regarding the question and answer period. Classes at Kansas State end at 20 minutes after 11. The next class begins at 11:30. Therefore, a number of students in the audience may wish to be here and participate in the question and answer session, but might be concerned about getting out for the 11:30 class. In order to avoid disruption of the total audience, we would ask that those who do stay in their seats, and we will interrupt the questions at 11:20 so that the students can leave, and then we'll continue on if there be questions. The Secretary will field his own questions, repeating those where there may be some difficulty in hearing. So the floor is open for questions.
And who's first? Yes, sir.
farm program, Mr. Secretary, where are you in terms of knowing what types of crops will be eligible for set-aside and what uses of these crops can the farmers make?
The question is, have we decided which crops will be eligible for set-aside and what uses can that land be put to? Is that correct?
What crops be grazed or hay?
What crops can be planted on the set-aside acres, and can those crops be grazed or hayed? We have announced a 20% set-aside on wheat. On Monday, we will get the crop report on feed grains, and on the weekend, this weekend, we will get the latest and best international crop conditions that we can obtain. And sometime within the next 10 days, or certainly before the end of September, we will announce something on the set-aside for feed grains for next year. In the case of wheat, we have no allotment, no base. We don't propose any. We propose to give the farmer maximum flexibility in adjusting to weather conditions and market conditions, allowing for full and free substitution between crops. And the old allotments restricted that movement, so they're out. Under the new proposal, the farmer will make a decision on how much wheat he or she intends to harvest. And whatever acreage that comes up to must be multiplied by 20%. In other words, if the farmer intends to harvest 1,000 acres of wheat, 200 acres of cropland that had been producing some crop must be idled, on which no crop can be harvested, upon which grazing will be permitted in the case of a drought disaster, or from which hay could be harvested in case of a natural calamity. We have not decided yet on the question of winter grazing. We'll decide that next week after I've met with the committees of the Congress and leaders of the wheat and cattle industry and other farm organization leaders. But the chances are that we will not permit the harvesting of any crop on those set-aside acres, excepting the emergency uses that I have described. The question of whether we will demand a cover is one we've not yet decided, but the chances are that we will leave it to the discretion of state and county committees of the ASCS. We expect that we will not get the best land in Kansas taken out of production. If you have poor land in the state, we'll get it. We know that. $5 wheat caused some land to be plowed up and planted that should never have been taken from grass. We would hope that that land would go back to grass, and that in those communities that land would be reseeded to a permanent cover, and that we leave that decision to the county and state committees of ASCS. In some regions, it doesn't make sense to require winter cover. California, the Imperial Valley, a major wheat growing area. It's a desert without water, and without irrigation, the cover won't grow. There is no erosion there because there is no wind and no rain, as we all know. And so does it make sense to require that land to be irrigated, to put a winter cover on? The answer is no. Makes no sense. So we would leave, chances are we'd leave these judgments to the state committee with a minimum amount of guidelines and control from Washington. That kind of land, mind you now, we're not making payments on, will result in a substantial reduction in land devoted to the production of grain in total. Now, how much of that will come at the expense of wheat and how much will come out of sorghums and or other feed grain crops, we don't know, because no one knows what the market conditions will be like between now and next summer. And we want, therefore, to allow maximum flexibility. 20% set aside on wheat is not going to get rid of the American wheat surplus. We don't expect it to. It will, however, prevent us from increasing these reserve stocks. which are at a point that are troublesome and require attention. About 1.4 billion bushels will be on hand when the next harvest starts. I'm talking now about wheat. And that's enough wheat to keep the prices down. And 20% set aside should result in a reduction of about 15% from what we otherwise would have. And no one knows what that might be, because it's, again, weather-related. At the moment, the rains have been coming here in the plains of Kansas and this general region, but it's still very dry in the rolling plains of Texas. It's still very dry in the hard red spring wheat in the Durham states to the north of you. Very dry in Canada. The Soviets have produced 2 good crops back to back. Can they produce a third? Who knows? And so we can guarantee, however, that the wheat stocks are adequate to meet our needs and to meet the needs of every one of our trading customers. There will be no embargoes. There will be no curtailment. We're going to sell all the wheat we can sell. But there's a limit to what can be sold now because of the international wheat situation. And so the 20% set aside will prevent us from increasing stocks, and if the weather is bad in large areas of the U.S., we could reduce stocks, maybe substantially. The decision was not an easy one. I recommended a set-aside on wheat after I had visited with the leaders of all the farm organizations. There were persons in the administration who argued there should be no set-aside on the grounds that we need this wheat to feed a hungry world. We don't quarrel with that. But the problem in this world today is not supply, but demand. People who make $150 a year income have no money with which to buy. And so it takes time to build their incomes so they can buy the wheat that Kansas can grow. And it must be approached in a prudent and careful-like fashion. If we were to not have a set-aside this year, and the stocks would build up to some much higher level, then next year the problem would be much more difficult. We'd have to go to a 30-40% reduction in wheat acreage, for which we'd have to make substantial treasury payments. And in a tight budget, we didn't think that was possible to get. More prudent to go some now and watch it next year and see what happens. I promise you the next answers will not be as long. Who's next?
In western Kansas, where you have a fallow system, what prevents a farmer from saying, well, my 20% set-aside will be my fallow this year? There will be no reduction in wheat production.
In western Kansas, where they have fallow systems as a common practice, what's to prevent the summer fallow farmer from dedicating that summer fallowed land to set aside, effectively destroying the set-aside program? There are 2 ways it can be controlled. We're examining both. One would be to not allow summer fallow on set-aside acres. Require that it be covered. The second would be to take all of the cropland on the farm committed to the production of crops. That is, all the land excepting summer fallow and pasture. And adding up that total. And when the farmer decided how much wheat he or she was going to harvest, the set-aside then becomes 20% of that acreage. And that acreage must come out from the cropland committed to production in the preceding year. We have either options available to us, and that, again, will be examined with the leadership of the Kansas and other state farm organizations to see which might be the most effective and the most sensible way to go. This year, if we go to a total cropland basis for the purpose of establishing a so-called depleting base, all the land on the farm excepting summer fallow and pasture land and wasteland, we would use this year's base. Now, if we decide not to allow summer fallow, then we don't need that base acreage determination. The farmer would determine the planted acreage for wheat for harvest and would decide on how much, would therefore be automatically committed to 20% of that to be taken out of production and not summer fallowed. That'd be easier to run, but it would require a cover on land that maybe can't be covered, in some cases at least. We may wind up leaving that to the discretion of the State and County Committee of ASCS. Require cover on some farms where the land is subject to severe erosion, and permit summer fallow in other regions where there is no serious erosion problem. That policy would give the local committee the responsibility that it would need to make the program make sense and yet be effective. Yes, ma'am.
Secretary Bergland, you've spoken about towards a national food policy. You've spoken about towards a national food policy. In view of the accumulating evidence that our food habits, and this, of course, is based upon the food supply, has something to do with the health of the citizens of our nation, what attention is being given by the USDA towards a food and nutrition policy?
In light of the question is, in light of the new evidence regarding the impact of diet and health, what is the Department of Agriculture doing to establish a policy on food and nutrition? The new so-called Farm Bill has a provision in it which puts the U.S. Department of Agriculture in a lead role mode in researching the impact of the diet on human behavior. The department, in its infinite wisdom, knows more about the nutritional needs of the dairy cow than we do of the human body. We know there's a linkage between diet and behavior. We know that a pregnant mother who has a deficient diet may produce an offspring that will have an emotional or physical disorder. But we don't know the exact linkage. We know that a youngster who is not well fed in the most formative years of his or her life may well be impaired for the balance of his or her life. We know from studies that at some of the penal institutions that changing the diet of prisoners can affect their behavior. And we know there's a linkage, therefore, but we don't know what causes these things. And we propose to find out. And so we are requesting money for research in this area. We're creating a group of experts within the Department of Agriculture who will be cooperating with universities and medical schools and other sources of knowledge in this matter to see really what kind of linkage there is. We have a small program in human nutrition going now. We have one at Beltsville where we're studying the impact of cholesterol. We have another at Grand Forks, North Dakota, where we're studying the impact of the diet and the pregnant mother and the behavior of the offspring. We know there's a linkage between some trace element deficiencies and the behavior of the unborn. But we know so little about this that we need to find out, and we shall. When we learn whatever is to be found, we will be giving the public information and guidance. Some of this will be painful, maybe. I don't know what we'll learn, but there may be a need for changing our eating habits for some. And we think, however, that the health of the American people is, of course, of paramount importance, and that we must learn and educate regarding diets and eating habits, really no matter what, and then adjust our agricultural policies accordingly. This is an exciting new frontier that the federal government has never undertaken. Sporadic research at some universities, and it must be pulled together. Yes, sir.
For policy,
the implication is that there could ultimately be total government control over food production, farm production, with the hazards to freedom and such, recognizing some need. But what safeguards could be taken that would prevent the federal government from taking over farm production?
I apologize for interrupting, Forrest. I do need to interrupt to permit those students who have an 11:30 class to depart, and we will continue with the questions for a few moments. We'll now proceed with the answer by the Secretary.
First, to repeat the question, on a couple of occasions I referred to food policy, which implies control. What assurances, therefore, are there that the government will not be involved in controlling the farm management plans, the marketing decisions, and other elements of private life which we cherish? The answer, so we don't get the two running together, is that we do not believe that it is necessary nor desirable to have a heavy-handed government presence in all places at all times. And we don't propose to try. We think, however, that there's need for some government supervision. For example, in the United States, the government does not import a pound of beef nor export a bushel of wheat. This is all done by the private business world, and they do a good job at it. But there are limits to what a grain company in Kansas can do in the way of developing markets in the European community. The European community has a tax on Kansas wheat. There isn't much the Kansas legislature can do about it, as good as they are. There's some here today. This is a matter that requires the attention of the national government. And so, as a matter of national policy, I have changed the role and the persons involved in the business of promoting the exports of American wheat. We'll have the best sales team that's ever been assembled, bar none, located throughout the world, selling American farm products. We have the finest quality, and our price is right, and we're competitive, and we're dependable, and we'll be there. That's a proper role. That's part of policy. What is not policy is to believe that the world is somehow a free and open society in which there are no restrictions and no limits. That's not policy, that's dreaming. When I was in Japan in June, the leaders of the Japanese government and other elements of the Japanese private industry asked me time and time again, will there be an embargo? Scared to death that we might embargo the export of soybeans or some other crop. And at that time, soybeans was the crop in question because we had a tight supply. And we assured them there would be no embargo, that we would let the market do the rationing, and we did. And we know what happened, and that's history. But the Japanese were scared to death. They were afraid that if they put their eggs in the American basket, that something might happen and these supplies would be cut off. And they cannot afford that. There's a lot of things they can do without, but they cannot do without food. And every place I've traveled, we've encountered the same kind of concern. Can we depend upon you in the United States? And we've assured them and reassured them they could. So we need, however, to recognize that we cannot allow somebody in the world to move into the United States in the dark of night and buy up everything that's strategic or important. I mean, we don't allow a foreign power to buy a major American defense contractor for security reasons. We don't allow that.
Because if we did, some foreign land could come and buy our military secrets. We don't allow that either. There are many instances in which we have intervention. We don't allow trade in some of these items that are strategic and important to the security of this land. So it is with some grains in some years. We have a deal with the Russians. If they need more than 6 million tons of grain and we are running short, they've got to talk to us. And we'll sell them grain, but we're not going to allow them to come in and raid our granaries without warning and then leave. We cannot afford to be the world's shock absorber. Now, we will be known as a dependable supplier of high-quality grain, but we want to do it in a business-like basis. We don't want to be caught by surprise. And so that requires a policy with minimum controls, if any, on production. We think these voluntary arrangements of the last dozen years or so have worked very well. In fact, we're stepping away from control by getting rid of the old allotments and the old bases, by giving farmers maximum discretion in making their planting plans, granted to the producer maximum decision-making authority, yet recognizing that we've got this big wheat crop. We got wheat that we're not going to sell at any price, because the world has produced 2 bumper crops of grain back to back. And the probability of a third record yield is not very high. One of the other major changes we're undertaking, in addition to the research in the area of human nutrition, is in trying to understand our weather better. We're negotiating with some of the scientific world to see whether and how and what we might be able to fly on satellite. We have excellent data gathering capability now via satellite, but there's some new things happening. Maybe we can read the topsoil moisture down 4 inches by satellite. Maybe we can get daily rainfall patterns and daily temperature surface patterns worldwide, or at least in key places, so we can measure stress, so we have some idea of what's taking place. In many countries of the world, not even the leaders of their government really know what's happening. Soviet Union, for example, very big place. They are not nearly as sophisticated as we are. We know what's going on in Kansas, but they don't know what's going on in many of the more remote parts of their country. And so we need information in the weather field. Whether we want to modify weather is another thing. I've been content to leave the weather to the Lord, frankly. Weather modification is one we better approach with great care. It's been suggested to me that we embark upon a policy of blackening the ocean floor 400 miles off the Pacific coast. And that if we blacken the ocean floor, this will warm up the waters of the Japanese currents, increase the rate of evaporation, and increase the rainfall in the arid regions of the western part of the United States. Maybe. What if it doesn't work? I mean, what if we have 40 inches of rain in Kansas every year? That's the kind of thing, you see, we don't understand. We know so little about it. So we're going slow on weather modification. And we're trying to increase our weather forecasting capability, however, because the weather conditions are so all-important. If I knew what the Russian weather was going to be like, if I knew what the Kansas weather would be like next year, I'd have better information and try to make a decision on set-aside. I don't have it. Yes, sir.
You've been listening to an address by and a question and answer session with the Secretary of Agriculture, Bob Bergland, speaking in the Landon Lecture series on public issues here at Kansas State University. The Secretary spoke before an overflow audience of more than 1,800 persons in the Kane Auditorium this morning. The event heightened by the fact that this is Governor Alf M. Landon's 90th birthday. The series, of course, held in honor of Alf Landon. Bergland's speech, entitled Toward a National Food Policy, offered an outline of administration proposals regarding food and agriculture. Engineering for the broadcast was by Del Staub and Ron Jones. This is Ralph Titus, and this is the K-State Radio Network.